It's over 4 decades since the birth of the nation called Zimbabwe. Would it be correct to call Zimbabwe a divided nation or a nation with unresolved conflicts? It is estimated that thousands of lives have been lost as a result of ethnic tensions since the country's independence, at the Entumbane clashes and the Gukurahundi massacre. Some say it's not ethnic tensions, but it is the ruling class eliminating their opponents. Why and what happened? Is it a Zimbabwean trait to be polarized? What is the matter? Is it the ruling class playing divide and rule tactics? Or can we say the citizens are accustomed to being in a polarized society? In Zimbabwe, you can't be neutral. Either Ndebele or Shona, either affiliated to the ruling party or the opposition. Either you are a Christian or you follow Chivano. It is always like a game and everyone is involved. But for now, let's focus on this ethnic tension. Who is Ndebele and who is Shona? What criteria were used to set apart these two ethnicities, and by whom? Does Shona exist? Does Ndebele exist? Is Zimbabwe a nation? What unites Zimbabweans? Let's rewind to before independence and look at how the Ndebele and Shona appeared. Historians say Ndebele and Shona tensions date back to the pre-colonial period and have posed a major threat to the nation's peace. It's proven the Khoisan were the first people living between the Zambezi and Limpopo, so all the other arrived later. The Tonga came first and then the Kalanga, then the Nyai. So where do the Shona and the Ndebele come from? According to historical evidence, Zambezia was dominated by Karanga and Tonga-speaking people from the 12th to the 19th centuries. Those were the people under Mwene Mutapa who took over from the Kalanga, and the Kalanga had taken over from the Tonga. Mwene Mutapa eventually was overthrown by the Rosi led by Changamire. Let us unpack the totems or the clans from these Bantu ethnic groups. Remember, we, the Bantu, don't have tribes, but ethnic groups. The Tonga totem is the lion, and from this comes Sibanda, Banda, Madau, Tau, and all others that are related to this main totem. The Kalanga totem is the lake, from which comes various types of water creatures, hippo, crocodile, fish, and many others. The Nyai Nyangwezi totem is a mountain from which comes various types of land creatures, monkey, elephant, zebra, buffalo, cow, eland, and many others. It is important to notice, apart from the Khoisan, all Bantu ethnic groups in Southern Africa can trace their roots to these 3 main groups. The Bantu are not related by language or geographical location, but by the bloodline, which is represented by the totem. In other words, if you are trying to connect with relatives, don't use the language or location. Follow the bloodline and use the totems. In other words, if you are trying to connect with relatives, don't use the language or location. Follow the bloodline and use the totems. Back to the historical events. what happened during the rule of Changamire, the Rosi Empire. Beach says, while the Portuguese influenced the northern chiefs during the 17th century, they didn't ruin the basic Karanga economic, social, and political structure. However, the end of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th centuries saw the permanent loss of Karanga territory in the southwest and southeast to the Tswana and Tsonga Hlengwe, along with the Nguni and Soto-speaking peoples crossing the plateau during the Mfecane period. The middle of the century saw two Nguni-speaking dynasties established: the Ndebele state under Mzilikazi in the southwest and the Gaza state under Soshangane in the eastern highlands. Where does the word Ndebele come from? During the early years of the Nguni migrations, Soto speakers of the High Veld called Nguni speakers Matebele, a name they used for all people who came from the coast. The term referred to the Nguni unique long shields. Eventually, the term was corrupted by Nguni speakers to become Ndebele. After the arrival of Mzilikazi on the High Veld, the name Matebele became especially attached to his fearful warriors, and historians later wrote of this period referring to the Matebele Wars. In the 1880s, the whole area was invaded by the Portuguese and the British, the latter making a large-scale settlement under the control of Cecil Rhodes' British South African Company. In 1889, the Gaza state moved to the southeast. As a result of this, the scale and nature of Gaza's influence upon the Karanga have not been given much attention by historians. Even though the Mzilikazi's Matebele has been examined more closely, some factors have affected both the available evidence on their relations with the Karanga and the angle of historians. Firstly, most Europeans' witnesses of Karanga-Nguni relations were influenced by the fact that they approached the subject both literally and figuratively from the view of the Ndebele state itself, which added to the assumptions they already have. Secondly, amplified estimates of the number, scope, and brutality of Ndebele raids on the Karanga were later used to justify the conquest of the Nguni by the British South Africa Company in the 1890s. Secondly, amplified estimates of the number, scope, and brutality of Ndebele raids on the Karanga were later used to justify the conquest of the Nguni by the British South African Company in the 1890s. Thirdly, Rhodes' claims to the Karanga area were based upon amplifying the scope of Ndebele's power. Fourthly, most accounts of Ndebele history after 1840 have tended to interpret the Ndebele in terms of their Nguni ancestry, ignoring the fact that the Ndebele Mtwakazi state was so much influenced by the Karanga because it took over from the Karanga-speaking Changamire of the Rosi state. The people in the area occupied by the Ndebele in the 1840s spoke the Kalanga dialect related to the Karanga and descended from the people of the Leopard Skopi culture who occupied the area from around the year 1000. In the 15th century, people of the Zimbabwe culture moved west into the Kalanga area, and sometime after 1450, the Torwa dynasty ruled over a state that was a successor to Zimbabwe based on Kami. Sometime between 1644 and 1683, the Torwa dynasty was succeeded by the Changamire of the Rosi, whose main centers were the stone buildings of Danangombe, Lolo, and Manyanga Ntabazgamambo. Even though the Kami culture was an extension of Zimbabwe, the Kalanga remained the basic population, and by the 19th century, the Rosi of the Changamire dynasty were speaking a variant of Kalanga. From the earliest days of Kalanga settlement, the economy of the area was strongly committed to the raising of herds because the dry environment of the southwestern plateau favored cattle breeding. In the early 19th century, the migrations of Mpanga, Ngwana Maseko, Zwangendaba, and Nyamazana, set off by the Mfecane, struck the Changamire state, which was poorly prepared to stand the attacks. In addition to that, drought and internal conflict weakened the Rosi state. The serious split within the dynasty was between the houses of Mutinima, son of Changamire Gumboremvura, and Chirisamuru, who was Changamire in the early 1830s. However, Changamire state withstood the attacks of Mpanga, Ngwana Maseko, and Zwangendaba, who were driven off, although they did a great deal of damage, taking grain and cattle. In the early part of the 19th century, the most important Rosi families were grouped in a ring around the Changamire capitals of Danangombe and Manyanga east of the Mbembesi River. In the western part of the Mbembesi, the Kami area was under a Kalanga sub-ruler, Ndumba. The Mutinima faction occupied the Mulungwane Hills and a wide area east of the Upper Lundi. Other Rosi sub-rulers of the main dynasty were Lukuluba Goko Hills, Rosani of the Vungu River, Swabasi of the Somabula Forest, and a ruler named Lembeu on the Mpopoti Range. The death of Changamire Chirisamuru at the hands of Nyamazana's group did not destroy the Changamire state. As a result, a Mambo was installed later before 1852. Towe Chipi succeeded him and he received the support of Mutinima. The Ndebele invasion was not similar to Adangoni in several ways. Firstly, Mzilikazi's people did not attempt to attack the central part of the Changamire state, but settled in the western province of Ndumba, west of the Mbembezi River. Secondly, they united the splits among the Rosi by entering into an economic relationship with them. The main body of Ndebele under Gundwane arrived from the Umzingwane Valley in 1838 to 1839. Ndumba's dynasty vanished from the scene relatively early, and the main resistance in the immediate area was led by Mutinima from the Mulungwane Hills. Mutinima, nicknamed Mafuta, was at first successful in his defense and may not have been pushed out of the hills until after Mzilikazi arrived. The Ndebele succession crisis undoubtedly delayed the impact of the Ndebele upon the Karanga, but even so, it seems to have been surprisingly mild. There are reports of some Ndebele raids made upon the local people in the first year, but they did not cause much bloodshed as compared to previous Ngoni invasions. Eventually, the Kalanga fled the Manzamnyama River and returned as tributaries of their new masters. West of the Mbembezi, the Ndumba's place was simply taken by Mzilikazi and his followers, who settled down among the Kalanga like what the Rosi had done before. It was thus logical that the Ndebele should not remain on hostile terms with the local people because they needed supplies of grain, which would not be forthcoming if raiding was continued for a long time. Around 1854, Moffat noted the Ndebele prosperity in grain, and in 1858 he confirmed that the Karanga were continuing to live inside the Ndebele settled area in their villages. This means the Ndebele became rivals of the Rosi as rulers of the Kalanga and other Karanga peoples. And in the period when the Changamire dynasty was weakened by the death of Chirisamuru, Mzilikazi took his place as king of certain Rosi families of the main dynasty. These, including Swabasi, Lukuluba, and Rosani, may have been motivated by internal political conflicts among the Rosi, such as their exclusion from the center of power and the succession, but they also had an economic motive